It's great to be here and great to be at the EIB. I don't think I ever did work for the EIB, but actually we did collaborate 15 years ago when I was working for the World Bank, and the EIB was also involved in a project, the Lesotho Highlands Water Project, which is a big dam that's transferring water to South Africa, and money from South Africa to Lesotho, this very small country. EIB and World Bank were funding this jointly, and so I met quite a few of the staff members at the time. Also great to be in Luxembourg. I grew up in Trier, so very close by, and it's always great to be here. Although I must say, most of my trips to Luxembourg didn't go further than the petrol stations in Wasserbillig. So I'm glad that I made it for the fifth or sixth time a further trip to Luxembourg itself. So today I want to, well, let me also apologize actually that I'm speaking while sitting. I'm unfortunately suffering from a neurological problem which affects my ability to stand and walk, and also a little bit to speak. So I will speak relatively slowly, and I hope you can bear with me. So I want to briefly talk about three topics in this conversation. First, I want to talk about the impact or the relationship between global inequality and greenhouse gas emissions. Then I want to talk about national inequality and the link that has to emissions. And third, I want to talk about economics and climate policy, which relates to the first two topics, but goes a little bit beyond that as well. So let me first talk about global inequality in carbon emissions. If we look at global income inequality, that has been falling since the 1970s. Not dramatically, global inequality continues to be very large, but has been reducing. In fact, let me just show you one measure of global inequality. This measure called the mean log deviation. It's one of the various measures, and you see the green one is global inequality, and you see that since the 1970s it has been declining slightly. What you also see is that it was driven by falling inequality between countries. So if I go back again here, so the inequality between countries has been falling, while in contrast, the inequality within countries has been rising. So between country inequality has been falling, within country inequality has been rising. The net effect was still falling global inequality. Why? What did between country inequality fall? Well, of course, China played a massive role in that. China was one of the poorest countries in the world in 1980, and its growth has contributed to dramatically falling global inequality. In addition, India and since the mid-1990s also Sub-Saharan Africa have grown faster than the world average, contributing to declining inequality. That declining inter-country inequality, of course, is good news for those who worry about global justice. It's also good news for those who worry about global poverty. So if we look at the global poverty numbers, so East Asia, the Pacific, East Asia and Pacific, which includes China, had 61% of the population in 1990 living below $1.90 a day. That has fallen to 4.1% in 2015. So we've had poverty reduction across the globe, particularly in this region, but also across the globe. There went from 37% to 9%. That has been unprecedented in history. So this dramatic developments in China and other emerging economies, and also since the mid-90s, you also see poverty reduction in Africa taking place from 58% to 35%. That has contributed to this much better picture of falling global inequality and falling global poverty. But what impact does it have on global greenhouse gas emissions? And the answer is, well, it has been bad for global greenhouse gas emissions. So in fact, one can show that the growth, this growth of the global south, which was a positive development, falling poverty, falling inequality, is actually responsible for most of the increase in greenhouse gas emissions since 1990. You can see that here in a few graphs that I will show you. So this is graphs I've taken from the IPCC report, so you can find them there. So between 2000 and 2010, for example, greenhouse gas emissions globally grew by 2.2% per year. And in the 90s, the growth was a little bit smaller. If we then look at where it came from, you can divide the growth of greenhouse gas emissions into population growth, GDP per capita growth, energy intensity, and carbon intensity. And all what you see is that most of the, in the 90s and 2000s, most of the increase in the greenhouse gas emissions was caused by rising population and rising prosperity, rising GDP per capita. But where? So that's what the next picture shows. So now the world is divided into different groups of countries. So let's first look at this chart. This is the high-income countries. And what you see there is total greenhouse gas emissions didn't grow very much after 1990 in high-income countries. They stayed nearly flat. But what happened is in the so-called upper middle-income countries, greenhouse gas emissions rose very quickly and have actually now reached the level of high-income countries. What are those upper middle-income countries? Well, China is in there. Brazil is in there, a whole bunch of other emerging economies, including Indonesia, Thailand, South Korea, and a few other mostly Asian economies, and some Sub-Saharan African ones, for example, South Africa or Botswana. And what you also see is the second area where there's growth was the lower middle income countries, which also increased their emissions substantially, while the very poor countries, the low income countries, not much happened. And below here, this is total emission. Now we look at per capita emissions, and what we see again, it's the upper middle income countries who are growing in per capita emissions dramatically. So that, in fact, one can show that of the total increase in emissions that took place between 1990 and 2010, more than 2/3 happened in upper middle income countries, and about another 20% in lower middle income countries. That includes, for example, India and Pakistan, Bangladesh, Ghana, Nigeria, and so on. And while in rich countries, they only account for about some 5% of the growth of global emissions. So, so we have a dilemma, quite clearly. A very positive development for the welfare of people in the world has also been associated with massively rising greenhouse gas emissions. So one may ask the question, well, why aren't these countries why are these countries on such a carbon-intensive development path? And why are they not developing, kind of learning from the mistakes that we did? We have had a very carbon-intensive development path. Well, and it turns out that it is very difficult for these countries to dramatically change the development path, at least in the short term, because as it was for us, it is for them as well. the burning of fossil fuels is by far the cheapest and most easiest option to expand energy production, and as a result, these countries have up until now followed very much the similar development trajectory that we have followed earlier when we were developing. We can see that very nicely in here. I just want to show you again. Actually, I should have shown you that. This shows very nicely how the upper middle income countries are really driving the growth in global emissions, not the rich countries and not the poor countries, but this has really been driven by this group of countries. Here's maybe a slightly confusing graphic. This looks at a whole bunch of different countries and their prosperity, as well as their greenhouse gas emissions over their historical trajectory. And so we have Mexico here, we have the United States over here. What we see is the United States was always a very carbon-intensive economy. Even when they were relatively poor, they were emitting a lot. And while Germany, I don't think Germany is in there, while some of the other countries, France, Japan, and so on, have a much lower carbon intensity. What you see here now is China. And what you see is that basically China is developing just like a European country in terms of its link between income and carbon emissions. Not as bad as the United States, but not any better than France or Germany or other countries. So in a sense, they are literally following exactly the same path way of emissions so far. You can see that also then when you look inside the countries and look at the rich versus the poor inside those countries. And there you see actually the emissions of the rich are exactly are in proportion to the income higher. So if the rich are 15 times richer than the poor, and they tend to emit 15 times more than the poor. So we have a very, very linear relationship, which of course means that it's not the case yet that the elites in these poor countries are leading less carbon-intensive lives. They're actually leading carbon-intensive lives that are proportional to their income. So to finish up the point on global inequality is at the moment first a dilemma. We see a situation that falling global inequality will, unless something dramatically happens, be associated with rising greenhouse gas emissions and will make it harder to reach the goals that we are trying to reach in terms of the climate. I'll say a little bit about what policy options are to combat this. So let me now come to the second point, which is what about national inequality and CO2 emissions? As I've shown you before, national inequality has been rising in most countries of the world, including most European countries, but also including most developing countries. So the question then is, what impact does that have on emissions? Does a more unequal country emit more carbon emissions, or does it emit less? If you think about this theoretically, it can be ambiguous. On the one hand, you might believe in the so-called environmental Kuznets curve, which basically says as people get richer, ultimately they will start to clean up the environment, they will start worrying more about emissions, and as a result, the emissions of the rich will be smaller than the emissions of the poor, because they're leading, in a sense, more environmentally conscious lives. That's the claim of the environmental Kuznets curve. That would basically say the larger inequality, the lower emissions. A second effect, let me talk to the fourth point here. Larger inequality can also have, in a sense, a more sinister effect with impact on emissions. Large inequality, particularly in poor countries, can push lots of poor people outside of the carbon economy. So these poor people have no access to electricity. They have no access to modern fuels. They have no money to buy petrol. So they basically are burning biomass. And if they're doing so sustainably, of course, then they're leading carbon neutral lives. Not by choice, but by necessity. And so high inequality can actually push more people outside of the carbon economy and therefore lead to lower emissions. On the other hand, there are two arguments that would suggest that higher inequality increases emissions. One is what people talk about emulation effects, that when you live in a highly unequal society, you often have the rich leading very lavish and often quite carbon-intensive lifestyles. They have yachts, they fly around the world, they have own little islands here and there, and everybody else in society, enviously studying the behavior of the rich and famous, also wants to do a little bit more of that. And as a result, they try to copy the lifestyles of the rich and famous to the extent they can. And in this sense, higher inequality would lead to more emissions because these emulation effects are even stronger. The second argument relates to political economy arguments. The rich tend to be those who benefit from high emissions because they are the ones who own the factories and the shares in the utility companies and so on. So they basically often benefit from a society that actually emits a lot. They themselves are, of course, not affected by that because they live in nice leafy suburbs and the pollution and the other problems are really suffered by somebody else. And if this is the case, where the poor are kind of suffering and the rich are benefiting from emissions, if you have then a high inequality, the rich tend to be politically more powerful. They're politically connected. They can basically tell the government that we shouldn't regulate emissions so much and so on. You look at what we see currently in the US. Yesterday, Donald Trump reversed a whole bunch of regulations related to coal, and basically has coal lobbyists basically are part of his government. And this is a classic kind of story that we would see, where basically the rich, or some rich at least, are benefiting from low regulation of emissions, and they're politically powerful to actually push through those things. So we then investigated this in the paper, what the total effect is. And what we actually find is that the effect of inequality on emissions depends on how rich you are. In poor countries, high inequality leads to lower emissions, and in a richer country, high inequality leads to higher emissions. And here's there's the limit. So if you are Romania, you have exactly no effect because you're exactly at the border between the rich and the poor. If you are the United States, Denmark, Czech Republic, Japan, or Luxembourg, of course, then higher inequality will lead to higher emissions. So it seems that the political economy argument and the emulation effects are particularly important in higher income countries, while in poorer countries, look at Malawi, India, Chad, Madagascar, high inequality actually leads to lower emissions, and that's probably because it pushes people outside of the carbon economy. And so, in a sense, the carbon sector is quite small in these unequal poor countries, which of course is not a happy situation for these countries to be in, but it lowers emissions, at least in the short term. So this seems to be the relationship between national inequality and emissions. So for most of rich countries, if you want to lower inequality, this would suggest this would also help lower emissions because these two things are linked. Now let me come now to climate policy. And here, this is partly related to my work on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, where I was in the working group 3, which was looking at policies to mitigate climate change. And basically what I discovered there is a very big dilemma that we have when we talk about climate policy. And the dilemma is that when you talk to climate economists, they will basically say, well, the whole climate problem has a very, very, very obvious solution. It's just that nobody listens to us or nobody does it. And the obvious solution to climate policy is what you need is a global uniform carbon price of somewhere between $70 and $100 per ton of carbon. You achieve that uniform carbon price either through a carbon tax or through an emissions trading scheme that basically ensures that the carbon price is uniformly everywhere at that level. That should be the only instrument you use. Just do a carbon tax or an emissions trading scheme, nothing else. And you should just address this problem by focusing just on this one problem, using one instrument. And lastly, of course, it will only work if everybody mandatorily participates, right? So we need a global deal with a global uniform carbon price that will solve the problem. And then the economists basically say, that's it, all right? So we don't really need to discuss any further because that's the solution. And then the only open discussion then is how to allocate the initial emission rights, which basically means how to allocate the burden. For example, should we give every citizen of the world the same emission rights, and then we start trading, or shall we give the poor more emission rights, or shall we give existing emitters more emission rights? That's an equity question, which their equity issues will just be important, but in a sense, that's just a way to get the system started. That will be the solution. But if you then look at the world, of course, we're very, very, very far away from this particular solution. And so one could, there's obviously two ways you can think about this. One way is to say, well, nobody listened to the economists properly, and if they did, we would all be better off. The other way to think about it is, of course, that economists totally misunderstand the political economy of carbon policy or climate policy, and so that basically they are in a little bubble talking about optimal policy, which has nothing to do with the real world, where totally different incentives and constraints are operating. So if you look at the reality of climate policy that we have today, it looks very different. We have very inefficient, very blunt instruments. So we use a lot of regulation, for example, to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. So we have regulations for the power sector, we have regulations for the automotive sector, and so on, which economists will always say, well, that's inefficient. It would be much better to do taxes and emissions trading. And we have fuel taxes instead of carbon taxes, which are, of course, not the same thing. But it turns out, actually, if we measure the effect of these policies, so far, these inefficient, blunt instruments actually have had the largest impact on lower emissions in rich countries, rather than the allegedly economically efficient ones. So in the EU, we do have an emissions trading scheme. So far, it has had no impact whatsoever on reducing carbon emissions, while boring, inefficient, blunt EU directives on energy efficiency, EU directives on biofuels, EU directives on the automotive sector actually have had quite a large impact on reducing emissions. Or we also use inefficient feed-in tariffs, which has also had a substantial impact on reducing carbon emissions. So instead of optimal efficient instruments, we use inefficient blunt instruments and still have an impact. The second thing is we are this world of mandatory participation. We don't live in that world. We will never get to a binding global agreement with mandatory participation. And I think finally in the Paris Climate Accord that was recognized. So now we no longer have trying to work towards a global binding mandatory agreement. What we are now working towards is basically a coordinated system of national voluntary carbon reductions, which of course most economists say they can't work because nobody will ever reduce anything. They will always ask the other ones to reduce. They will always want free riding. But it turns out it seems to be working. So the EU has made a commitment, China has made commitments, a whole bunch of countries have made commitments to voluntarily reduce carbon emissions, even though that's irrational. So we have inefficient blunt instruments, irrational policymakers signing up for voluntary deals. And the third thing that we have is that when we try to figure out why is China doing something about climate change and why is India now thinking very hard about climate change, the answer mostly is not because they want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but mostly because they're really worried about air pollution. Air pollution is a terrible problem in China. It's now a worse problem in India. And so countries are actually doing something about greenhouse gas emissions because they're worried about air pollution, which is number one issue and a massive problem in many developing countries. Number two, because they're worried about energy security. China basically knows it cannot continue its high growth with expanding coal production at the level it's currently doing, because it doesn't have enough coal for that. It will become increasingly dependent on Indonesia and Australia to import this coal. They're worried about that. They want to have a more energy secure future. So now they're investing in solar power and wind power, a bunch of other things where they feel that they will gain in terms of energy security. And the third reason why countries start doing climate policy or reducing greenhouse gas emissions is tax reasons. Many times they've actually subsidized the use of fossil fuels, and it's getting too expensive for them. So Indonesia recently used to spend 20% of its budget on fuel subsidies. And of course, that couldn't go on forever. So basically now they've cut the fuel subsidies to zero, not because they're worried about the climate, no, they're worried about the budget. And what is happening is that co-benefits, that's the kind of IPCC lingo for these issues, co-benefits are the main drivers of action in developing countries. So countries are doing stuff not because they want to reduce emissions, but they want to reduce air pollution, they want to gain energy security, they want to save money, or maybe they want to raise money through taxes. And the fourth thing that we see is climate action. Instead of having one instrument, we have climate action taking place everywhere with many actors. So in the EU, we have, for example, an emissions trading scheme. We have in Britain, still a member of the EU, but not for long, the carbon tax underneath that emission trading scheme. We have in Germany feed-in tariffs under this emission trading scheme. Every big city in Europe has a climate policy of various things. incentivizing people to insulate houses or whatever. We have big companies even doing climate policy on their own. So we don't have one instrument, as the economists would tell you, one instrument to be efficient, but we have many instruments at different levels taking place at the same time. So, again, two ways to look at this. Either the world is inefficient, irrational, has the wrong incentives, and does all this action without any purpose, or the economists are kind of misunderstanding that actually the way climate policy works is actually along those lines, and we have to live with those approaches to climate policy rather than always try to think about the first best option. So, if we take this world seriously the way it is, then the consequence of a better climate policy would be the following. First, instead of trying to talk about the reducing greenhouse gas emissions, we should focus more on the co-benefits. So we should try to help countries reduce air pollution rather than telling them to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We should help them diversify their energy sources, move into renewables as a form of energy security rather than as an explicit climate policy. And maybe we should also help them reform the tax systems so that they move away from energy subsidies. That's my second point. Instead of trying to create this never world of a global carbon trading system, what one should at the moment focus on what I would call the low-hanging fruits. Let's first phase out energy subsidies in developing countries, which are still massive. Let's move towards fuel taxes. Let's start doing some mild regulation in order to get climate policy going, rather than trying to develop the perfect system. Third, let's focus, instead of just arguing against those blunt instruments, let's focus on improving them. So, for example, if we could have regulations to phase out the use of coal, we should improve fuel taxes by making them progressively broader. For example, in Europe, stopping to have lower fuel taxes on diesel, which is, from a climate policy point of view, a very bad idea. So basically start with the existing blunt instruments and try to make them better, rather than saying regulation and taxes are terrible. What we need is just a uniform carbon tax. And fourth, that's the most, in a sense, the most important issue, I would say. We need to investigate how these many, many policies that different layers of government are doing, how they interact with each other, whether they actually reinforce each other or whether they undermine each other. And here we unfortunately have a problem in Europe. So we have at the top of our system an emission trading scheme. The problem with that is that whenever any member state or any local government or any company starts doing some climate policy, what it does is it actually reduces emissions from that source. That drives down the carbon price in the emissions scheme, and some other European country will then emit more. So basically, Britain's carbon tax, all what it's doing is it's reducing emissions from Britain and increasing emissions from everywhere else, because it's driving down the carbon price. So what we would actually need to do is one of two things. One would be, we should have done a European-wide carbon tax rather than emissions trading scheme. Then you wouldn't have this problem, because the carbon tax will still be there. And so if Britain has a carbon tax and Europe has a carbon tax on top, they will just reinforce each other. They will just get bigger instead of undermining each other. Now, of course, I don't need to explain to you that doing a European-wide carbon tax is not easy because taxation, we don't have any European-wide tax and at the moment, and so one could only have a coordinated European-wide carbon tax as we do have with value-added taxes, but that's not easy. Or the second option would be to say each time another jurisdiction does something on climate policy, the emission trading scheme has to react immediately. So when Britain does its carbon tax and says we will save whatever 50 million tons of carbon, we need to go to the emission trading scheme and take out 50 million tons of emission trading certificates immediately so that we don't get to this situation. So in a sense, we would need to have an emissions trading scheme that is immediately responsive to all the policies that are being done below it. We don't have that right now, and we find it very difficult to reduce emissions allocation in the European emissions trading scheme, and so this is a problem. But it has a solution. So let me conclude. Reducing global poverty and inequality will increase greenhouse gas emissions. So we need policies to decouple greenhouse gas emissions from economic growth. And what I'm trying to suggest to you is we should focus on policies that look at co-benefits and low-hanging fruits first, rather than trying to get to this perfect system immediately. Second point, reducing inequality will increase CO2 emissions in poor countries, but lower it in rich countries. And economies are currently not contributing to a better climate policy because they're focused on this one totally unrealistic way of solving the problem. And so they need to abandon the first best approach, focus on co-benefits and low-hanging fruits, improve blunt instruments, and focus on interactions. Thank you very much.